As a hospital security guard, I was ready to handle all kinds of people. But looking at the security camera footage, I felt completely unprepared and ill-equipped to deal with what I had seen. When one of the morgue workers came to me frantic about a missing body, I assumed that somebody broke in and stole it. I had always heard some people had strange and nefarious uses for human corpses. On top of that, they were always willing to go to extreme means to get those bodies. This raised some concerns, so he brought me to the morgue to investigate. When we got there, I saw why he was so shocked and confused. There were footprints. This guy's body wasn't stolen. He was alive, and he was tracking dirt or mud around. The morgue worker picked up the chart and said the person was a John Doe. We didn't really know much about this guy, except he was presumed dead. According to the worker, the guy was about 6 feet tall and a redhead, so he'd be easy to spot. I ran back to my station and started looking back through the security cameras. I went from high traffic areas to less busy areas of the hospital, until I noticed something. I saw more tracks. I checked a few other cameras until I saw the tall figure meandering through the hallways. It wasn't easy being the only security guard on staff for the night. Our small-town hospital was barely able to run a skeleton crew. Luckily, the building wasn't too big, but I was still one person looking for a John Doe wandering around the hospital. I found the footprints again and tried my best to follow them through the corridors. I saw patients and doctors standing to the side as I did my best to track our missing person. Unfortunately for me, none of them claimed to have seen the person who left the prints. The mud was growing more sparse, and I realized the prints were fading as they went on. Soon, I found myself following footprints that had pretty much vanished. I continued walking in the direction the footprints were going until I came to a dead end. I reasoned that it was time to start checking rooms. Most were empty or had sleeping patients. My fists clenched from agitation. I only had another hour or so to resolve this before the next guard to relieve me came. I didn't want to be the guy that just passed off his problems to someone else. I was about ready to head back to the morgue when a voice came on over the intercom. "Can we get security in the surgery wing? Can we get security in the surgery wing?" I ran over as fast as I could and saw the problem after bursting through the doors. John Doe was in a ripped hospital gown, wrestling one of the doctors to the ground. He had the older man in a headlock. I ordered a nurse to call the cops and threw myself into the fray, pulling the erratic man off the doctor. Immediately, I locked his arms in a vice-like grip so he couldn't thrash as hard. A nurse immediately came to my aid, grabbing his legs. Another rushed in with a syringe and stuck the guy's arm, sedating him. His thrashing and yelling gradually ceased until he finally lost consciousness. When the cops arrived, they cuffed the guy to a hospital bed. Despite his outburst, doctors worked to get him stable and tested. I later found out that he was mistakenly brought to the morgue. EMTs responded to a call about a potential overdose. Apparently, his heartbeat slowed down so much they thought he had died. CPR hadn't worked and neither had the defibrillator. But somehow he woke up in the morgue and freaked out when he ran into the staff. At least that was one mystery solved. Hours of work wore me down, which is why I was so caught off guard by what I had seen in the morgue. My job was to assist the coroner. That meant reading through files, doing inventory, gathering tools and supplies, and helping him examine cadavers. That night had been a particularly busy one. Towards the end of my shift, I was just about ready to collapse. We had one more body to examine for the night. I went to the storage shelves to retrieve it. Entering that room always sent a chill down my spine. I lined up the gurney with the shelf I needed and opened it. Everything clicked into place when I pulled the body out. I remembered to grab the deceased's clipboard as I pulled the gurney to the examination room. Mr. Jacobson was waiting for me. Once the gurney was situated, I handed the clipboard off to him. He adjusted his glasses while I masked up and brought out the tray of tools. I finally got my first look at the body. It was a man. He looked like he had to have been in his early 20s. His body and face showed some signs of trauma. From the glimpse I had of his info and the minor cuts on his face, I reasoned that he was in a car crash. The longer I looked at his face, the more something felt off. His features began to feel familiar. Then recognition hit me right in the chest. He was my boyfriend's younger brother, Benny. Everything went numb after that realization hit me. I felt lost and disoriented. I turned to Mr. Jacobson. He was still looking at the clipboard. His lips moved, but nothing registered. I think I managed to mumble something before forcing my legs to carry me away. I couldn't navigate in this mental state. I just walked, mind blank, until I found a door and pushed my way outside. The cold air and drizzling rain slowly pulled me out of my fog. When the realization hit me again, I thought about my boyfriend and his family. My heart began pounding faster as I checked my phone. But there weren't any messages, no signs that anything was wrong. I put my phone away when Mr. Jacobson stepped into the doorway. "Is everything okay, Erica? You're not normally squeamish." "I'm sorry, Mr. Jacobson. I think I know that person." "Oh, Erica, I'm so sorry. Now I don't know what to believe. It all happened so fast. I'm not entirely sure." "You don't have to go back in there if you don't want to. I can handle it myself if need be." "Can I come back in just to check and be sure?" "Of course." With that, we both stepped inside, closing the exit behind us. I followed the doctor back to the examination room. I fought with my heart and mind, trying to get myself under control. It was difficult, but I braced myself for the potential pain and emotions I was about to feel. The tension in the room was palpable. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the side of the gurney. It wasn't pain I felt. It wasn't anger or sadness. I wasn't numb, but confusion struck me. The man on the gurney before me was different. He looked older than the man I was expecting. There were a few similarities, but I was immediately able to tell it wasn't the same person. "Well?" The coroner's tone brought me out of my shock. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jacobson. I realize I was mistaken. This isn't a loved one of mine." "That's okay. I'm relieved you didn't have to go through that. Are you able to help me with this?" I looked down at the body again. The same signs of trauma I noted before were still there. "Yes, I can." In the hour that followed, we looked over the body and learned everything we could about it. Our friend was a car crash victim. According to reports from authorities on the scene, he was in a head-on collision. Eventually, we were able to call it a night. As I walked back to my car, I checked my phone again. The anxiety came rushing back when I saw I had calls and messages from my boyfriend. After reading through them, I realized my worst fears had come to fruition. Earlier in the day, Benny was involved in a car crash. It was a head-on collision. The other driver died while he was taken to the hospital in critical condition. A little over an hour ago, he passed. All I could wonder was why? Why had I seen his face on that gurney? Everyone had heard about the owl killer. The hunt for this vicious monster grew more tense each passing day. He displayed an inhumane level of brutality with each of his kills. One of the obstacles for the investigators was the simplicity of his kills. It left little room for clues or mistakes we could capitalize on. He never left messages or anything like that for authorities until that night. As I examined one of his latest victims, my gloved finger caught on something unexpected, a bump on her head. That wasn't normal. It wasn't typical of him to leave some kind of mark like this. So I took a closer look and found an incision on the victim's scalp. One of the more alarming details was that it had a surgeon's precision. After cutting the bump open, my heart leapt into my throat. He left a folded piece of paper inside her scalp. When I had heard about the gruesome state of his first victims, I came to the conclusion that he was a dangerous man. When I was brought onto the investigation team and tasked with examining bodies, I shed the notion that he was a man. Everything about the state of the victims screamed that he was some kind of monster. We were 2 months into this investigation. The FBI had to be called in. The public was losing trust in the institutions meant to protect it. Even with all the resources at our disposal, we had little to nothing in terms of leads. As I called my colleagues over with news of a clue, I turned back to the victim. I saw her young face and the potential she had with her whole life ahead of her. The victims were seemingly chosen at random. There was no set pattern. They varied in age, race, gender, class, you name it. We couldn't find any connections or tie him down to a specific area. The only thing the victims had in common was the method of their murder. Their necks were broken and their heads were twisted around completely. Even more terrifying, the evidence suggested that he did all of this with his bare hands. I carefully unfolded the paper that had been hidden in the young woman's head. It had been folded many times over. My colleagues stood on the sidelines, watching diligently, waiting to see what had been hidden. The potential for this to provide us with some kind of lead revitalized the investigation. After minutes of careful handiwork, I unfolded the paper to discover a handwritten letter. We needed to examine this under a lens for the letters to be legible. As the words popped up on a screen for us all to read, I felt my peers' eyes turning to me. My skin crawled and I felt like my heart would explode at any moment. The killer addressed his letter to me. To Leslie Fuller. In my own way, I've been keeping tabs on the investigation and its team. I have to say, you've impressed me. So far, you've been the closest when it comes to determining my motives and identity. I'm afraid to say that makes you dangerous, and I'll have to ask you to refrain from investigating any longer. If I find out you haven't stepped away, you'll get a first-hand look at how I do what I do. Best, the Owl Killer. Sweat trickled down the side of my temple. My jaws clenched. I reread his words. He had been following our investigation, meaning that we had a mole, or worse. The killer was someone on the team. Copies of the letter were passed up the chain, and I was kicked off the team. Following that note, bodies were examined more thoroughly, and everyone on the team was interrogated. Disappointment hung over me like a shadow. I still wanted to put the guy away, but part of me felt the swell of relief. Provided he kept his word, I could rest a bit more easily, knowing I wasn't on his list. Still, his words and the victims haunted me for years. Despite not being involved in the investigation, I followed the case in the news and by word of mouth from my peers. They never found any solid leads. When they asked for input, even in private, I told them I couldn't give any. I still couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I stayed on the case. Would I really have come face to face with that monster?